Hello and welcome to another LeetCode problem. Today we're going to be continuing on with the JavaScript challenge and we're going to be doing promised time limit. So in this problem you're given an async function fn and a time in milliseconds and return a new time limit version of the input function. Fn takes arguments provided the time limit function. The time limit function should have the following rules. If fn completes within the time limit of t milliseconds, the time limit function should resolve. And then if fn exceeds, the time limit function should reject with the string time limit exceeded. So they give you these explanations. So essentially you want to give your function some time to run, and then if it doesn't work, then you want to give it time limit exceeded. And so, they are kind of hinting that you need to use a promise, right? You need to have a resolve and reject, which is perfect for what a promise does. So we are going to need to obviously have a promise. So in our function, we are going to need to return a promise here. And so that part is straightforward, but then let's figure out what would happen, right? And so what we actually want to do is let's just try a normal promise at first and talk about it. So we're going to return a new promise, and a promise takes a resolve and a reject, right, as always. And then it's going to have a function that does something. And so these resolve and reject are functions in the promise. And so let's just, for now, let's just do a setTimeout, right? So what we could do is we can just do a setTimeout of whatever time we're given, and then we can just, the way we're going to do this is if this amount of time goes by, we're just going to automatically call reject. So that's going to be pretty straightforward, right? So we can just say setTimeout, and then we're going to give so remember setTimeout has to have a function, so you can't just write reject, you have to actually give a function, but then you can write reject in here. And so essentially now we can write time limit exceeded here. And what this is going to do is if the promise doesn't resolve, then it's gonna do the setTimeout. So actually, just to briefly mention this, setTimeout will execute regardless, but if the promise resolves already and then you reject, that's not going to work. So that would be fine, right? Like once a promise resolves, if reject is called afterwards, it's not going to be an issue. Okay. So now that we have that, what else do we need to do? Oh yeah, so we need to also, so remember, setTimeout actually takes a function and it takes a time. So for this time, it's going to be t. Yeah. Okay. So now that we have that, what else do we need to do? Well, now it's pretty straightforward. So now we can just say, okay, let's just try calling the function on the args. And the way this works is you can do, if it's an async function, you can just do a then, like in a promise chain. So then you can resolve after, like let's say the function actually did run, then you can resolve, and then you would have a catch if there was some other error, reject. And so this would work, I think. Let's just test it out. Okay. So that does work. Let's see if it, I think there's only like one test, but who knows. Anyway, so this does work. So essentially what we're doing, once again, so we have a promise, it takes a resolve reject, and the way a promise, you have to give it resolve and reject conditions usually. And so we're saying if t passes, then we're going to reject. Otherwise, if the function completes, then we're going to resolve. And then we can catch the reject method in here. And I'm curious, I think this will still work, but let's just double check. Like, I don't think we have to have this, but I think it's just good practice. I think this is actually for, let's see, module, circular dependency. Yeah, so I think it's actually, I think we do need to have this, because we do need to catch the reject is what it's saying. Yeah, so our error originated either by throwing inside a function without a catch block. Yep. Okay. The promise was rejected with error, and then error unhandled rejection. Exactly. Okay, so this catch is actually catching this rejected thing right here. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we have one problem in here, though. And what do you think that is? So the problem is actually, this setTimeout, like I said, it's going to be called regardless of if the promise is completed or not, and so this is unnecessary. And so what we can actually do is in the promise, there's a then, there's a catch, and then there's a finally block. and the finally, you want what you want it to happen is you want it to resolve. But if it resolved, you actually don't want to have this setTimeout be called. And so the way this works is we can actually just have like a constant timeout or something. We just need some kind of name. So setTimeout actually returns, I think it's like the name of the setTimeout or something. And the way to clear it, the way to make sure the setTimeout doesn't execute is there's actually a clearTimeout, and then you pass it the name of the setTimeout. So you just say something equals setTimeout, and then you could say clearTimeout timeout. And then essentially what will happen now is if this resolves, then it'll go to the finally block, then it'll clear the timeout, because we don't really need it to reject. We don't need the promise to reject after we've already resolved. There's no point. So this is essentially like a memory leak, and we don't need to have this. So we can actually clear the timeout after it resolves, and that works as well. Okay. That's a little slow, but I guess maybe there are a lot of testing conditions. Okay, so I did want to mention a couple more things, so let's go through those. So that's one way to do this. Now, another way to do it actually is to, instead of just returning a promise, we can set something equal to it, and we're going to have a promise race. So I'm going to show you how this works. So we can have like constant, and then we can just have like successful or something. Promise. Do we want to have a time limit promise? No, I think this will actually be, yeah, so I think this will actually be a failed promise. Yeah, okay, because I think it'll reject, yeah. Okay, so we're going to have a failed promise equals new promise, and then this is all going to be the same, but now we're going to change it slightly. And so what we're actually going to do is we are going to, instead of doing this fn args, catch finally whatever, we're actually going to have a constant, and this is going to be successful promise. Okay. And so now that we have these names, now what we can actually do is, and I think this needs to be here. Yeah. So let's just put that here. Double check here. Successful promise, resolve, reject. Let's see. So that needs to go here. That should not be here, I think. And then, oh, actually, no, that should be here because that's this right there. Resolve, reject. So we're actually gonna put the setTimeout in here. And the way our promise is literally just gonna pretty much always reject, essentially. So we're just gonna say let's return a promise that always rejects, and now we're gonna have a successful promise here, and I'm gonna talk about exactly how this works. So we're gonna have a successful promise here, and now there's something called a promise race. So it's like this, promise.race, and then you can pass in an array of promises. So you can say failed promise and successful. Right. So as you can see, it's not even resolving, but you can't just write reject. Like you can't have a promise only reject, I'm pretty sure, because a promise either takes two arguments, a resolve or a resolve reject. So you still have to pass both, you're just not using this. But essentially what this is doing is this failed promise will just run, and it will always reject after setTimeout. And then we have a successful promise that runs the function on the arguments. So what promise race does is essentially it'll return whichever one happens first. So if this promise rejects, it'll return the failed promise. And then if the function finishes running, then we're going to have a successful promise. And so that's going to be how that works there. So this is essentially like a little bit simplified code of the other version. It's a little bit unintuitive, and I haven't really seen the promise race used. Yeah, I haven't seen it used much, but I also haven't been coding in JavaScript for too long, so maybe it is used. But anyway, let's try this. Just want to explain that other way of doing it. I think the try catch finally is more traditional. I think there's two traditional ways, and I'll show you the other one in a second. This one's kind of unique. That's pretty rare, but good to see. You know, if you see it, you'll know what it does. Okay. So that is the second method, and now there is the other traditional method, which is the await method. And so we're going to be using the async await method. And so the way that's going to work is we're going to have, let's see here. We do need to have a, this is going to be pretty similar, like this part of the code, except we're going to have a little bit differences, but I'll get into that. But essentially, so when you use async await, you want to have a normal try catch block. So you want to have like a try block, and you want to have not like a, you know, then.try, then things like that. You want to have like a normal try catch block. That's really similar to like this is really similar to how try catch works in other functions, right? Okay, so we're gonna actually get rid of this, and then in our try catch block, we are going to try to run the function. So we can just say like constant output or something equals, we're going to call await here on function args. And essentially what await does is it doesn't let any other code run until this actually returns. So it's saying like, let's halt here, let's wait for this function to run. And so it's important to structure your code in a way that you know this is going to happen. So if you have some code down here, this is going to halt until this function actually returns. And so that is important, and you need to make sure that that happens. Okay, so we're going to wait, and actually, so now in this promise, so this promise actually needs to not return here, I believe. I think it needs to return at the end of like all of this whole thing. And this is not going to be a guaranteed failed promise anymore. So we're going to just return a promise here again. We're not going to say guaranteed failed. Okay, but we are still going to have this reject. I just want to have these parentheses are correct. Let's see. So that's correct, and that's that. Yeah, I think it should be good. Okay, so we're going to try to do the, actually get the result. And then, so in our try block, we're going to say, let's await for the function, and if it works, let's resolve, right? So then we can resolve the output. And then we're going to have a catch, and in our catch, we're going to reject. So whenever you get into a catch block, it's essentially saying your promise, like, something got screwed up. And then finally, you are still going to want to have that clear timeout, as I said, right? So if our promise does actually, like the reject, if it gets to the reject, it will return here. But this resolve will run. And so essentially what you want to do is you want to have a try, you want to have a catch, and then you do want to clear the timeout eventually. So timeout, and that's why we need, yeah, so we're going to use this timeout again. And let me just make sure all of this is correct. Okay, so let's actually go over what this does. Okay, so now what we're doing is we're returning a promise, and we're saying, okay, so if the setTimeout runs, let's call reject. And if the reject runs, it'll actually go, I think it'll actually, yeah, I think it won't go here. I'm not entirely sure if it goes here. I think the way that this works is if there's an error, yeah. So if there's an error, then it will go here, like an actual error. So sometimes sometimes what's gonna happen is, let's say you are fetching data. Like we made a chat room recently, and you're fetching data, and your fetch failed, right? That's when you're gonna want to have this catch block with your error saying like fetch failed, or you can print out some stuff, or you try to post and then it failed. So that's gonna be what you're gonna want it for. Technically, like when we actually made a chat room, when the error fails, if you don't really care, like if you're just going to keep trying to fetch data until it passes, and you know it's going to pass sometimes, you technically don't even need a try catch block, but it's just good to let you know, like, hey, I have this error, maybe, and I need to log this error, I need to do something with it, and then I can look at it later, right? Like in a real production environment, you're probably going to want to like log your errors and say like, oh, there was some leak or something happened, and so this is where you would be doing that here in this catch block. But yeah, essentially, so we're returning a promise. It's going to have this same kind of logic with the setTimeout. And then we're going to try to wait for the, so remember, this is going to await as long as it takes to get the actual function in the arguments. And then it's going to resolve. But otherwise, if the time has gone, then it will reject. So it'll be like the same kind of thing, whichever one happens first. And so these are the two most common ways to do this, either async await or like a promise chain with then. I personally prefer async await, but we did forget one thing. So whenever you call async await needs to be called in an async function. And so actually the function is this promise function, but this is not an async function. So because this is an anonymous function, I think we can just do something like this. And if you try to run it without async, we can actually try. I think it should just give us an error saying like, hey, you need an async function. Well, let's see. A little slow. Or yeah, so here you go. Await is only valid in async functions and the top level bodies of modules. So yeah, so whenever, that's important to recognize, is whenever you use await, you have to make sure you use async. And then the other part is make sure you structure your code knowing that await is gonna wait. It's kind of making a asynchronous function kind of like a synchronous function where you're waiting for your output. You're no longer just saying just go throw it in the background whenever it's done. You're saying no, I'm gonna wait here for my output. Okay. And so hopefully that makes sense. And then the setTimeout will run, as well. So you're going to be waiting for output, and you're going to have the setTimeout. And whichever one happens first is what you're going to have. And yeah. Okay, so now that we add this, let's see what happens. But yeah, this promise stuff definitely get confusing. I haven't been using for too long, so I'm still getting used to it, but definitely getting through it. Let's see here. Accessing non-existent property. Okay. Oh, it's because this needs to be error. All right, so you catch an error and then you call reject with it, and then it'll do some stuff. You can also like console log it or do whatever you want to do, or log it to a file. Okay, there we go. But yeah, I think promises are a little bit straightforward once you get used to it. You just have a, resolve, reject, and then you figure out what are your resolve conditions, what are your reject conditions, things like that. And then getting used to the whole asynchronous nature of JavaScript is definitely weird because it's the only language with async, so definitely going to take some time, but good practice. Okay. At least the only language with async that I've used so far. Okay, so it's a little slow, but it works. And so we are just going to say it worked. And that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully you liked it. And if you did, please like and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.